The old woman begged shelter with her two daughters. What the mountain man did changed everything. Coldridge Mountains, Wyoming Territory, winter of 1889. The wind howled through the trees like a widow in mourning, long and hollow, dragging flurries sideways across the blinding white of the mountain pass. Snow fell in frantic swirls, thick as ash, muffling every sound except for the labored breaths of three figures moving across the frozen landscape. Martha Ellis, wrapped in a worn shawl, led them. 56, shoulders hunched with age but spine unbroken, she moved with the steady determination of someone who had seen too many winters to be afraid of one more. Behind her, Lila supported her younger sister, Nora, who limped weakly, wrapped in a patchwork coat far too thin for the cold. Each step was a battle. Nora coughed violently, a raw, chest-deep sound that echoed through the trees. "Hold on, sweetheart," Martha whispered. "We'll find shelter." They had been walking for hours, turned away from ranches, ignored by miners, shunned at every door. The world had grown cold long before the storm hit. Martha had begged, not for pity, but for a corner of warmth, a place by the fire, just for the night, and each time a door had slammed in her face. Now, as twilight bled into the storm, the trees parted briefly, revealing a single thread of smoke rising against the dark sky. "There," Martha said, her voice cracking. "Do you see it?" Lila squinted through the white. "A cabin." Martha closed her eyes. God, just one more miracle. Inside that cabin, Wyatt Hale sat alone by a small fire, sharpening a hunting knife with slow, practiced strokes. 30 years old, a man carved from silence and pine. A mountain man by necessity, he'd left the world behind after the fever took his wife and child 5 years ago. Since then, he'd lived by the seasons, trapping, mending, surviving. He wasn't expecting visitors. A sudden knock shattered the quiet. It wasn't a polite tap. It was frantic, desperate. Wyatt froze. The wind screamed through the cracks in the window, but the knocking came again. He stood, cautious, but curious, and opened the door. 3 figures swayed in the snow. The eldest woman stood barely upright, her gray hair iced to her cheeks. One girl was leaning heavily on the other, too weak to stand. The woman's voice cracked. "No one gives us shelter. Please, just let the girls inside." Wyatt looked at them, at the girl with blue lips, the older sister with wary eyes, the mother holding them together with nothing but will. He didn't ask who they were, or why they'd come. "Get in," he said simply, stepping aside. "You're safe here." They hesitated for a second, as if afraid the kindness might vanish if they moved too fast. Then Lila helped Nora across the threshold, and Martha followed, shoulders sagging. Wyatt shut the door against the storm. He knelt by the hearth and stoked the fire higher, then fetched a tin pot and poured in water, tossing in pieces of jerky and dried vegetables. As it simmered, he pulled out a crust of bread, broke it into bowls, and poured the hot broth over it. "Eat," he said. Martha helped Nora to sit near the fire, holding the bowl as the girl's hands shook too badly to grip. Wyatt offered a second bowl to Lila. She took it without a word, her eyes never leaving his face. "Thank you," Martha said, voice trembling. "You've saved their lives." Wyatt didn't answer. He knelt beside Nora and draped his thick coat over her shoulders. Her small hand reached out, clutching the fabric, then his sleeve. Her grip was weak, but it anchored him. He looked at the 3 of them, frozen, half-starved, but still standing. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and damp wool. Wyatt moved with quiet purpose, setting a kettle of water over the fire, then kneeling beside Nora, whose breaths came short and shallow. Her skin was clammy, her cheeks hollowed by cold and fatigue. He dipped a cloth into the warm water, wrung it out, and gently cleaned the scrapes on her hands. "She'll be all right," he said softly, more to himself than to the others. Martha nodded wordlessly, her shoulders sagging. Wyatt fetched a small tin of salve from the shelf and rubbed it carefully onto Nora's cracked lips. Then he stood, ladled stew into 3 chipped bowls, and handed them out. When Lila hesitated, glancing at him with cautious eyes, he placed the bowl on the table instead, and stepped back, giving her space. She nodded, barely, but accepted it. He offered his portion to Martha without a word. "You should eat," she said. "I've had worse winters," he replied. They ate in silence, the fire the only sound in the room aside from Nora's labored breathing. The storm raged outside, wind pressing hard against the cabin walls, like some wild beast trying to claw its way in. But inside, there was warmth, however fragile. Wyatt sat by the fire, mending a torn blanket with thick, careful stitches. Martha sat across from him, her hands cradling the bowl of stew like it was something sacred. "I was a nurse," she said quietly, "on the Union Pacific line. When my husband passed, we moved down toward Fort Bridger. Thought we'd find work, shelter, something." Wyatt didn't interrupt. "Lost our money to a rancher who said he'd keep it safe. Then to a man who promised land." Her voice turned bitter. "Only thing he promised was hunger." Nora stirred in her sleep and coughed, a deep, wet sound. Lila knelt immediately, wrapping her arms around her sister. Wyatt rose and fetched a heavier quilt, draping it over the girls. "Thank you," Martha said. "I ain't got much," Wyatt muttered. "But what I got, you can use." The words settled in the air, quiet and sincere. Later that night, Wyatt pulled his thickest coat from the peg near the door, worn and patched, but lined with fur, and tucked it gently around Nora's shoulders. She murmured something incoherent in her sleep, clutching at the fabric. Wyatt stepped back, watching her with an expression he hadn't worn in years. Not since his younger sister died of fever in a winter not unlike this one. Lila sat curled near the hearth, her hands clasped tightly, eyes never quite leaving Wyatt. She didn't speak, but he noticed how she gently pulled the blanket tighter around Nora, her fingers brushing the girl's forehead. That simple, protective gesture stirred something deep in him, tender and unspoken. "She loves that child more than breath itself," Martha said later, as Wyatt refilled the kettle. "I can see that." The wind outside moaned through the trees. Wyatt added wood to the fire and glanced over at Lila, who now lay beside her sister, one arm around her, eyes half closed but not asleep. She was still afraid. Of him. Of the world. He understood. Hours passed. The kettle hissed. The shadows shifted. And when Nora's cough worsened near midnight, Wyatt didn't hesitate. He sat beside her, lifted her gently into his lap, and wrapped the blanket tight around them both. Her body was burning now, her fever climbing. He could feel it through the fabric. He held her close, rocking slightly, whispering, "You're safe now, little one. You're safe." Lila stirred and saw them. Wyatt's back hunched, Nora's head tucked under his chin, the firelight catching in the dampness at the corners of his eyes. She didn't speak, just watched. And something inside her shifted. It wasn't trust. Not yet, but it was the beginning of it. Wyatt stayed awake the rest of the night, feeding the fire, wiping Nora's brow. When the fever finally broke near dawn, and her breathing eased, he sighed, with a relief he hadn't felt in years. Martha slept in a chair, her chin on her chest. Lila had drifted off beside her sister, hand still wrapped protectively around the girl's arm. Wyatt looked around at the sleeping faces, the patched-up walls, the fire still burning. And for the first time in many winters, the cabin no longer felt empty. The morning broke in shades of silver and blue, soft light stretching across the snow-laden trees like cautious hope. Inside the cabin, the fire still crackled, casting warmth over the quiet scene. Nora lay curled beneath a heavy quilt, her fever finally broken, her breathing steady for the first time in days. Martha sat beside her, wiping her daughter's forehead with the edge of her sleeve. Tears streaked her weathered cheeks. "Thank the Lord," she whispered. "She's cooler now. She might just make it." Wyatt poured warm water into a tin cup, handing it over silently. Martha took it with shaking hands, nodding in gratitude. From the opposite corner, Lila stood, arms crossed over her chest. Her eyes were fixed on her sister, but her jaw was set. "We've stayed too long," she said suddenly. We should be going. Martha looked up, startled. Lila, end of the state. In the rester. We've already taken too much from this man, Lila continued. We don't belong here. Wyatt, who had been tending the fire, looked up. He didn't raise his voice. You step outside, you'll freeze before you make it a mile. Roads are buried. That storm won't clear till next week. Lila met his eyes. She didn't answer right away, just stood there, jaw clenched, like someone trying not to break. I don't want your kindness to turn into regret, she said softly. Wyatt leaned against the table, arms folded. It won't. There was a beat of silence. Then Martha sighed and sat back on her heels, her voice thin. We've been turned away from so many doors, she said, eyes distant. They say I'm too old to be useful, that my girls are just mouths to feed, that we're a burden no one wants. She glanced toward Wyatt, as if embarrassed to speak further, but the words kept coming. My husband passed last spring, pneumonia. We sold everything to try and start again, but folks don't take to desperate women asking for warmth. Wyatt didn't move, but something flickered behind his eyes. They said I looked like I was one winter away from the grave, Martha finished, chuckling bitterly. The room fell quiet again. Wyatt looked at the floor for a long moment. Then he spoke. This cabin's been empty for years. You're not taking anything from me. He walked to the shelf, pulled down a stack of old blankets, and tossed them near the hearth. You'll stay until she's better. Lila's breath hitched slightly. We can help, she said, her voice low. I'm sure you can, Wyatt replied. There was no ceremony in the way the decision settled, just a quiet agreement hanging in the air, like frost clinging to the windows. Martha squeezed his hand. God bless you, Mr. Hale. Wyatt shook his head. Just Wyatt. Later, as the day wore on, Nora stirred and asked for water. Martha fed her with a spoon, whispering comfort while Lila sat back, her arms wrapped around her knees. She stole glances at Wyatt as he fixed the door latch that had begun to stick from ice buildup. He worked in silence, his motions steady, precise. Too steady, too kind, and that scared her more than the cold. She wasn't used to kindness that didn't demand something in return, not from a man, not anymore. So she kept her distance. But in the firelight that night, as Wyatt handed Nora a piece of dried apple and watched her smile for the first time in days, Lila felt the smallest crack form in the wall she had spent years building. Winter still held the land tight in its icy grip, but something had begun to thaw inside the little cabin in Coldridge Mountains. By mid-morning, the snow had stopped falling. A pale sun hung low behind a gauzy sky, casting silver light across the frosted trees. From outside came the faintest of sounds, Nora laughing. Her voice echoed lightly between the trees as she played with a stick, pretending it was a sword, her cheeks red from cold, but no longer from fever. Inside, Martha stirred a pot on the stove, her hands more steady now. The scent of something warm, beans and old spice, filled the air. She hummed an old tune under her breath, one she used to sing when her husband was still alive. Wyatt stepped out from the woodshed, carrying firewood. He paused for a moment, listening to Nora's laughter. Then his eyes drifted toward Lila. She was standing stiffly near the chopping block, both hands gripping the handle of an axe far too big for her. She looked up, eyes uncertain. Let me show you, Wyatt said softly, not stepping too close. Lila hesitated. Then she nodded. He approached from behind but kept a careful distance. Feet shoulder-width apart, he instructed. Hold the handle like this. Let the axe fall. Don't force it. Let gravity do the work. She mimicked him. The first few swings were awkward, unsteady. Her hands trembled with the cold and the unfamiliar weight. Wyatt stepped behind her, adjusted her grip gently, only touching her gloves, not her skin. Try again. This time the axe split the log clean in two. A small smile flickered on her lips. They spent the next hour like that, saying little, working side by side. And though no words passed between them beyond instruction, something was being built there, slowly and quietly. That evening, Lila sat with Wyatt near the fire. Nora had fallen asleep early, curled beside her mother. Wyatt was carving something from wood, slow and methodical strokes, shaping a horse from a chunk of pine. Lila watched, her voice barely above a whisper. "You trust too easy." He didn't look up. "I don't think so. You took us in, just like that." He set the carving down, brushing wood shavings off his lap. "People show up half frozen on your porch. You don't ask questions." Lila wrapped her arms around her knees, drawing them close. "I've known men who would." Wyatt's gaze lingered on the fire. "I've known those men too." She hesitated, then let the words come. "Back in Oregon, a man promised my mother land if we worked for him. We stayed 5 months, cleaned his home, worked the fields, helped raise his children. When the season ended, he turned us out with nothing, said we owed him rent for the roof over our heads." Wyatt didn't speak, just listened. "I stopped trusting men that winter." He nodded slowly. "You had every right to. I don't know how to feel safe anymore." There was a long pause before Wyatt replied. His voice was low, steady. "You don't have to feel safe with me. Just be here. That's enough." She turned to look at him then, really look. The lines on his face weren't from age, but from weather and sorrow. The way he held himself, not proud, but steady. A man who had learned gentleness through grief, not softness through ease. "Maybe," she said, "you're the first man I've met who doesn't want anything back." Wyatt shrugged lightly. "Maybe I do. Just not in the way you think." Silence settled between them again, but it was no longer heavy. Later, Lila reached out, took the small wooden horse he had finished carving. She traced its curves with her thumb. "For Nora?" He nodded. She smiled, full and unguarded, for the first time since they had met. When she stood to leave, she paused near him, her voice barely audible. "Thank you, for today." Wyatt didn't answer with words, he only nodded, eyes meeting hers in the quiet glow of firelight, and in that moment, something in both of them shifted, not enough to call it love, but enough to say the frost had begun to melt. The small bed Wyatt built for Nora stood beneath the window, its frame simple but sturdy, carved with care. Nora had picked a red scrap of cloth to serve as a curtain, and each morning, she would peer through it to see if the snow had melted. Wyatt had done the work quietly, not expecting thanks. But when Nora threw her arms around him that afternoon and whispered, "It's the nicest thing anyone's ever made for me," he'd looked away quickly, blinking faster than usual. That same day, Lila and Nora helped him mend the broken section of the horse pen. Wyatt had handed them both gloves, smiling as Nora wrinkled her nose at the smell of the leather. "You ever hammer a nail before?" he asked, handing Lila a small sack of iron nails. "I've watched it done," she replied, lifting the hammer a little too stiffly. He showed her how to angle the nail so the post wouldn't split. Nora, meanwhile, crouched nearby, stacking firewood into small pyramids just for fun. For a moment, they looked like any family at work, a strange thought that Lila tried to shake. But that night, as she laid a blanket over her sister, she overheard her mother's voice, soft and tired. "As soon as she's better, we'll leave. We've stayed too long already." Lila stood frozen behind the cabin door, her hand on the latch, her chest tightened. The warmth she'd allowed herself to feel, the trust, the laughter, the soft moments by the fire, suddenly felt fragile, even foolish. When Wyatt passed by the hallway a few minutes later, he caught the tail end of Martha's words. He paused, then moved on without saying anything, the sound of his boots on the wooden floor unusually quiet. The next morning, Wyatt rose early, before the rest stirred. He stepped outside and scanned the snow near the barn. His boots crunched over prints he hadn't made. He crouched low, tracing the shape of a sole. Not mine, not theirs. He followed the tracks to the side of the woodshed. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, the saw blade he'd kept hanging on the wall was missing. Later that afternoon, he noticed one of the hens was gone. No blood, just gone. He said nothing. That evening, while Nora played with her carved horse and Martha stirred soup over the fire, Wyatt sat sharpening his knife with a slow, steady rhythm. Lila sat nearby, stitching the torn hem of her skirt. She watched him, sensing something off in the way his jaw flexed, the tightness around his eyes. "Did something happen?" she asked finally. Wyatt paused. "No." She frowned. "You sure?" He nodded. "Just a little more snow coming." But the lie hung in the air, thin and brittle. That night, Wyatt double-latched the barn, then stood outside longer than usual, watching the tree line. Snowflakes drifted down slowly, thick and silent. Somewhere out there, something was stirring. He could feel it. Inside, Lila caught the look in his eyes when he came back in. She didn't ask again. She just handed him a mug of hot broth without a word. And Wyatt, for the first time since they arrived, took it without hesitation. The wind howled like a wounded beast, rattling the shutters with each blast. Outside, snow whirled through the trees, thick and blinding. Inside the cabin, the fire cracked and spat, but it was not enough to keep the chill at bay. A long, low howl pierced the darkness beyond the walls. Nora flinched and clung to Lila. They were curled together on the rug near the hearth, wrapped in blankets. Wyatt sat nearby, cleaning his rifle with deliberate motions, every sense on edge. Another howl, closer this time. Then a thud at the barn door. Wyatt froze. He rose silently, motioning for them to stay back. Lila reached out, her hand grabbing his sleeve. "Be careful," she whispered. "I will," he said, locking eyes with her for just a second longer than he meant to. He moved to the window, parting the curtain an inch. Shadows moved in the storm, 4 of them, men, on foot. He cursed under his breath and reached for the lantern. "They found us," Martha said quietly, standing near the kitchen table, her voice low but certain. "It's them. From the trail. They want me dead." Wyatt didn't ask how she knew. The fear in her eyes was answer enough. Outside, one of the men shouted over the wind, "Give us the old woman, and no one else has to bleed." Wyatt stepped outside before anyone could stop him, rifle in hand. "She ain't yours to take," he called, voice clear despite the storm. "You turn back now, or you'll regret staying." A shot rang out in answer, grazing the corner of the porch. Wyatt ducked and fired back, shattering the branch beside the lead man. Inside the cabin, Lila grabbed Nora and pushed her toward their mother. "Stay down. Stay low." Another bang, glass shattered. One of the back windows had been smashed. Someone was inside. A heavy boot creaked on the floorboard behind her. Lila turned. A man with a crooked scar across his jaw was raising a knife. She didn't scream. She grabbed the fireplace poker, remembering Wyatt's stance, the way he'd told her to anchor her feet. The poker connected with a crack. The man stumbled, cursing. She struck again. He dropped the knife. Wyatt burst in moments later, blood trickling from a cut at his brow. His coat was torn, and his breathing ragged. "You all right?" he gasped. Leela nodded. "Behind you." The leader of the group lunged through the open door. Wyatt twisted, but too slow. The man tackled him, and they fell hard against the floorboards. The fight was brutal. Elbows, fists, a grunt of pain. The man pulled a blade. Wyatt blocked it with his forearm, but the edge sliced deep. Lila didn't hesitate. She grabbed the rifle Wyatt had dropped and swung it hard across the attacker's back. He roared in pain and rolled off. Wyatt kicked him away, panting. Blood seeped through his sleeve, staining the floor. Outside, the remaining 2 men saw their leader stumble out the door, cursing, holding his side. "We'll be back," one of them shouted. "You can't hide forever." Then they disappeared into the storm. Inside the cabin, silence returned, broken only by Wyatt's heavy breaths. Lila knelt beside him, tearing a strip from her apron to press against the wound. "You shouldn't have gone out alone," she said, voice shaking. Wyatt managed a weak smile. "Wasn't gonna let him hurt y'all." Tears ran down her cheeks as she tied the cloth around his arm. "If you had died." "I didn't," he said, touching her wrist gently. "I'm here." She looked at him, eyes full of something raw and real. "If you ever say that again like it doesn't matter, I'll knock you flat myself." He chuckled softly, then winced. "Deal." Martha watched from the corner, Nora curled up against her. She said nothing, but the look in her eyes said it all. Something had changed. Not just tonight, but forever. The morning after the storm broke calm and golden, sunlight slanting across the snowbanks like a quiet blessing. The trees outside stood still for the first time in days, their branches heavy with the remnants of last night's fury. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low but steady. Smoke curled gently from the chimney into a pale blue sky. Wyatt stirred from a light sleep in his chair, rubbing his shoulder where the bandage tightened across his arm. His side ached from the fight, but the pain felt distant now, overshadowed by the silence that wasn't empty anymore. He stood, stretching slightly, and turned to find the table already set, a small bowl of oats, 2 slices of dried apple, and beside them, a pair of woolen gloves, small and slightly uneven, but clearly handmade. Nora sat nearby, beaming. "I made them for you," she said, her voice clearer and stronger than it had been since her first step into the cabin. "You gave me your coat when I was freezing. Now your hands won't be cold either." Wyatt looked down at the gloves, then back at the girl. "Thank you, Nora," he said softly, his voice catching just slightly. "They're perfect." She nodded, pride blooming across her young face. "You're welcome, Mr. Boone." From across the room, Lila stood by the stove, half-turned, watching. The smile that touched her lips was quiet, but unmistakable. Wyatt caught it, and held her gaze just long enough for something unspoken to pass between them. Martha, sitting at the window mending a tear in one of the blankets, spoke without looking up. "That child's not the only one who's warmed up to you," she said. Wyatt raised an eyebrow. Martha continued, her tone gentle but direct. "Lila, she needs this place more than she lets on, more than even she knows. She spent her whole life waiting for the next door to shut in her face. But here, this is the first time she's started to believe one might stay open." Wyatt glanced at Lila again. She had turned away now, pretending to busy herself with the kettle, but he saw the way her fingers trembled just slightly as she poured water. Then Nora looked up at him, face earnest and clear. "Mr. Wyatt," she said, "can I ask you something?" He knelt down beside her, his body still stiff from the night before. "Of course." Her hands folded tightly in her lap. "You already protected us once. You kept us warm. You stopped the bad men. But, could you do more than that?" He blinked. "What do you mean?" Nora's voice softened, but there was no hesitation in it. "Could you be our family? Could you protect Lila? Not just now, but always." Wyatt felt the breath catch in his chest. It wasn't the first time someone had asked something of him, but this was different. This wasn't a plea. It was hope, carved into words. He began, then stopped. His throat was thick. He looked at Lila. She stood still, not moving away, not hiding. Her cheeks were flushed, but she met his eyes squarely. She didn't smile. She didn't speak, but her silence held more truth than a dozen promises. Wyatt looked back at Nora. "I don't know if I deserve to be anyone's family," he said at last. "But if your sister lets me, I'd like to try." Lila didn't look away. And for the first time since his world had gone quiet all those years ago, Wyatt Hale felt the echo of something returning. Not noise, not chaos. Belonging. The snow melted slowly that year, reluctant to leave. It peeled back in thin, wet sheets from the roof, trickled down into thirsty soil, and gave way to the first green shoots of spring, pushing through the earth like hope unburied. The valley had changed, and so had the cabin. Inside, laughter came easier. The silence that once settled like dust on the floorboards had lifted, replaced by voices, warmth, movement. The scent of wood smoke mingled with herbs, drying above the stove. Life had crept back in, step by quiet step. Martha Ellis sat on the front porch mending a torn sleeve, her hands slow but steady. "I've roamed enough places for 3 lifetimes," she said, mostly to herself, but loud enough for Wyatt to hear from the yard. "I reckon it's time I put roots down before the wind scatters me for good." Wyatt, sawing the last notch into a sturdy wooden bed frame, looked up and smiled. "Then you're welcome to stay, all of you." He finished the bed that afternoon, sturdy, smooth, carved with care. It was built for two. Nora and Lila would sleep comfortably, side by side, no longer curled up on the floor or pressed close to the fire for warmth. He'd measured every board twice, not because he doubted his skill, but because this bed meant something more. It meant permanence. Behind the cabin, Lila knelt in the thawing soil. She dug with bare hands, placing seeds in careful rows, her sleeves rolled high. A garden was beginning to take shape. Beans, carrots, and late potatoes. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. The act of planting something was an act of staying. "Watch them grow," she had told Nora, "and you'll know this is home." Nora, for her part, had taken to Storm, Wyatt's old gelding, like she'd known him all her life. She brushed him daily, fed him apples when no one was looking, and rode slow circles through the clearing, grinning wide beneath the spring sun. "Wyatt says, I've got good balance," she'd said one morning, "like a natural." Then, after a pause and a shy smile, "He's gonna be the best brother-in-law in the world." Wyatt hadn't heard that part. Lila had. One evening, when the light slanted gold across the prairie, and the wind smelled faintly of thawed pine and new grass, Wyatt stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching the land. Lila stepped beside him, her skirts brushing his leg. They stood in silence, the kind that said everything. Wyatt exhaled slowly, his voice low. "I used to think there was nothing left worth keeping, that everything I touched would just drift away." Lila looked at him, then reached down and gently laced her fingers through his. Her voice was soft, certain. "Now, you have us." He looked down at her hand in his, calloused and sure. No grand gesture, just presence, just truth. Behind them, the cabin glowed with lamplight. Martha hummed an old tune from her railway nurse days. Nora's laughter echoed faintly as she finished grooming Storm. The smell of stew drifted out the open window. In the distance, the grass rippled like water under the breeze, and far above, the sky stretched wide and clean, ready for whatever came next. The wild still whispered through the trees. The wind still roamed, but in one small cabin tucked against the edge of the Coldridge Range, something rare had taken hold. A home, a family, and the beginning of something they had all thought lost for good. And that was the mountain man who took in 3 strangers and found a family in the snow. A story of quiet bravery, unexpected love, and the kind of home you build not from wood and stone, but from trust, healing, and second chances. If this story warmed your heart like a fire on a cold night, tap that hype button to show your love. And don't forget to love stories for more slow-burn romances, frontier courage, and tales that remind us, sometimes, the wild is where the heart finally finds its place. Until next time, ride safe, love deep, and keep believing in the good that's still out there.